do stop me and let me know. I have 2 examples of turning our data into reports, and so I want to have a minute to share those with you too. I just didn't want to start with those because you know how reports can be like cross-eyed feeling, like when you see all the stuff in a 60-page thing. So I just wanted to start with this. And before I start, one thing I wanted to say is we're kind of excited about this. So we have kind of this other version of the partner tool, which is called Partner Me, and it's for collecting this personal network data. And we've picked a date that we're going to do another webinar on just on Partner Me to show you how it works, how it works, especially around in a like clinical setting or connecting people to resources, and how you can use a network approach to really understand a person's, I've heard so many, you all said this in different ways, but you know, how a person's informal and formal networks interact in ways that build resiliency and, you know, the kinds of network social support that people need because they know they need it, not that we know they need it, and how to connect people to resources and resource databases. So anyways, I'm not going to talk about it. It's something we've been working on and it's so much fun. It's such a neat project that we've had some funding for over the last year, and we're finally ready to start launching it in different spaces. So join me then and we can do that. What I wanted to do today was I picked a project that we'd worked on, and I thought I would just talk through the project in this kind of informal way. This project's a little bit old. We did it some years ago, but it was a 3-year evaluation of an early childhood council initiative here in Colorado, where there are early childhood councils throughout the state, and they are legislated. And so these are networks, and they are located kind of by county. There's a little bit of variation, or counties that are mixed together. And we were asked by CDPHE, which is the Colorado Department of Public Health and Environment, and the Colorado Department of Human Services Office of Early Childhood to do these network studies to really see how this early childhood system was working related to home visitation and health integration, which were these focus areas. And needless to say, back then, it was like no one was really paying attention to home visitation, a little bit about health integration, but this was, you know, you can see starting around 2011, 2012. I always say that was during baby number 2 for me. I've had 3 kids, and I just think of which baby it was on. And I distinctly remember being pregnant during the first part of this. But we were looking to measure systems outcomes and focusing on collaboration between organizational, so partners. So it was at that level. And we did this at 2 points in time. And I have some of that longitudinal stuff. I wasn't planning to bring that all in today because, you know, I could do a whole thing on longitudinal. But I will show you, you know, kind of how we worked. So we did this in 12 counties. The response rate here is referring to one county, one that this data was pulled from. And this one was a little lower than the rest. So we talked in other webinars about how to like set up a network strategy, how to modify the survey, and then how to collect the data. And if you are wondering how to do any of those things, you know, go back, and those are all online for watching. And this is now assuming we have sent those surveys and we have responses back. To be honest, 50 and 60, 50 is kind of low for a partner survey. 60% is a little more what we expect, and maybe even 70%. Especially when there's only that many organizations in there. But this is a very rural county that I pulled this data from. What we did, I thought this would also be helpful, because if you're trying to put together a project, we don't just like say, hey, we're just gonna do data collection with you. And none of you are just doing that because you're all embedded like deeply, right, in these communities. So it's not like you're just gonna jump in as an external, oh, maybe you are as an evaluator, but you know, what we did is we went in and we did a 1-hour introductory, like, hey, here's what we're up to. It's my network science, you know, thinking like a network scientist talk. Here's why we're thinking about networks. We did a half-day on-site meeting with stakeholder groups where we did a foam board, thumbtack, and rubber band activity to say, because what we were really trying to do is get these people to really think about networks as nodes and lines. It's really hard to present a whole bunch of network data to a group when they don't have that concept, you know, that framework. So we were trying to get people on board with the nodes and lines concept. Then we did the surveys. Then we did a debrief meeting at each site, and there were 12 sites, 12 networks. And then we did a webinar with each one to help them understand their data. So besides how do you take data and interpret it, like this is the support that we will give. This is like very intense for us, support for a community to really hold their hand with the data. The reason I think this is necessary is because it's different from saying like, here's a pie chart and 50% of you said this, right? We're like, here's a network map, make sense of it. So just to get, I mean, a few of you said like, Seamus, when you said like, oh, I'm just, the strategy of more is not better is what I'm going with. Like just the mindset shift, you know, of like, the network might be able to run in a different way is something that most people kind of need, you know, you got to take them through that. So that's what we did. And then at phase 2, which was really interesting, we had several meetings to collect feedback on the survey revisions. And I can tell you, since we're friends here, I stood up in front of this group of 12 and I talked through this and I felt like I was punched in the gut. I mean, there was a group there that was like, we hated this survey more than we hated anything else that we've done the whole last year. And JT, I don't know what's going on there, but they also said, one of them said, one of the people called me crying because they didn't want to do this. I mean, it was like so traumatic and I really felt terrible. But I can tell you this, they said to us, also the results didn't give us attribution. It did not say that we were responsible for all this work and all this change. And so that's the first time in a survey we added a critical question on the next survey, which is very simple. And on our survey templates, it's on there now. And it simply said, when you pick a partner on the survey, how was that relationship created? And was it created because of the early childhood council? And I'll show you how we use the results, but that we use that every time now because it lets us attribute the results of the data back to the project, right? And we need attribution. They need to show the return on investment. We need to show that what we're doing is affecting systems change. And sometimes we feel bad, like we don't want to ask whether systems building is because of this thing we're doing, but it is, and we need to be able to show that to our funders and our legislators in this case and all kinds of folks. So through that very difficult meeting, which I remember posting on Facebook that night about what a terrible day it was because it was so bad. We got such good feedback that it really made a difference in our phase 2. And I think we ended this with a lot more buy-in. And you'll see there the last bullet said site-specific TA to translate the data to practice. So really in time 2, we worked with them one by one just to say, what do you need? So I know that is a lot and it's not expected of everyone. And, it's community-based research and it's how, you can choose to partner with folks or not. And that we don't always have the opportunity to do that. A couple other things I wanted to say. So, and you've probably seen me say this before, but what I want to talk about is what we are measuring and not what we are not measuring. So when we're building partnerships for systems building or networks, there's this work we do, convening stakeholders, needs assessment, leveraging resources. It's the network building part. And then let's say I just picked an outcome, child and family outcomes. Whatever, we might want to be talking about HIV prevention or healthcare, for whatever the topic is. We want to attribute partnerships to that outcome. And it's almost impossible because all these other things are happening in the world. There's funding going up and down. People are coming in and out. We have new leadership. It's just really hard to attribute our partnership to the outcome. So what I try to really focus on is that what we're really measuring with this SNA is what happens in between. It's all that network work that happens to get us to that outcome. I think if you want to attribute partnerships to outcomes, it's more of an academic exercise like hypothesis testing, and it helps when you have a lot of data. It's very difficult to do it in one context except through description and explain it, that kind of explaining and understanding. But what we are measuring are things like perceptions of value, trust. You all know Darren Hicks now, so measuring authenticity, looking at perceptions again of goals, outcomes, and process, measuring coordination, efficiency. So when we measure these things and we get numbers on these things, then we can start to translate that, turn it into strategies and actions, and that should lead to the outcome. And I know that that might sound to some like a cop-out, like people are like, we really want to look at outcomes, but the thing is, like, when I stand in front of funders or legislators and I'm like, you're funding networks, what you're funding is this thing in the middle. You're not funding the outcome, actually. You are actually funding this thing in the middle and this work and process that's happening that can lead to that. So these process outcomes, we have to let people measure them, understand them, and improve them if we want to get to that outcome. And my little note here is asking the question, how can I use this information to manage the system, to manage this network, is the key to translating data to practice. I keep seeing the little chat thing come up, so I'm going to open it just to see if there are any. Okay, just wanted to make sure there were no questions. Okay, let me know. Maybe you all can just let me know if there's a question for me. And I love, talking in the chat.
Danielle,
yeah.
Danielle, this is Cap. And that point you were making about the experience you had at that site visit when folks were like, this was so horrible and awful.
Mm-hmm.
I have a feeling that it's scary for people, partner organizations that have been working together for a long time to document value, trust, authenticity between each other. So that must be kind of a hard emotional thing to do, and maybe it isn't as good of a relationship as one partner believes that the other one doesn't experience it equally. So is that kind of what they were talking about?
Oh, I wish, Cap. No, they like hated taking the survey.
It was just survey fatigue.
They were like, because this is what happens. Okay, so let's say you, Cap, so Cap, I'm this will sound like I'm picking on you for a second. You and I are similar where we're kind of outsiders to the network, right? But let's say, JD, I'm going to assume that you are more integral into your network. When you are part of your network and you say, like you have said to your group, listen, if we get data, maybe we can be better together. Let's do this. And they still might hate it. So let's do this. But it's different than when your funder comes along and says, hey, group, to comply by your funding, you have to do this survey. And so us at VNL, we more often get asked that latter thing, where funders come and ask us, or an outside evaluation is asked for. That's when things are different. And it's either internal buy-in or an external force comes in. So in this case, I would say, someone said to me once, it's an N of one, when that one, you can have 100 people and one person is on you, and I'm so sensitive. It just feels like the world is crashing. It was only this very small subset and one network in particular that hated it that much, but it felt like.
Right.
To your other point, what's so interesting to me is that I've been part of networks where they will say, oh, this is going to be so important because our trust is so bad. And then they take the survey and it doesn't show that. And then I've always wondered, are the questions bad or what? And I think people are reluctant to report sometimes that hard truth.
Yeah.
And so I think what you're mentioning is really real. And I think that if you can get the data on that, it is, I'll show you an example when we get to it of a hard truth that popped up in a network. And I mean, so hard that the person who runs the network was like, don't show that to our network. And how we can kind of spin it into like, well, if we don't know the hard truths, how do we get better? So if we're just here to say that we're all doing great and everything is well, when it's not, we're not really here to do good network building. It's just the truth. So, yeah.
Thanks.
Yeah. Okay. I won't really go through what partner is. I just kind of have these slides in there to give always our hat tip to Robert Wood Johnson Foundation as a big thank you and what it does. I think the group here is pretty familiar. It sounded like, so I'm just going to skip right to the good stuff. I did just want to bring this up, what we measure. And so a lot of network analyses are just a structural analysis, the interrelationships, where you'll see reports of like density and centralization and all of that stuff. And at our next NLTA, I'll bring up a little bit more like SNA stuff. That's an important part of a network analysis. And I will admit, almost all of them stop there. I mean, almost every single one I've seen. We've created this survey and partner and these other ways that we like to measure, and you can measure anything you want, around things like contribution. I called it attribution earlier. So important. So this is kind of our framework that all of our questions fit into. Perceptions is the number one thing you can measure, I think, in a network analysis. Getting the, I always say, and you've probably heard me already, there's no real relationship than our perceptions of each other, and your perception of me and my perceptions of you, that's our relationship. But it's like completely invisible. And so if we can collect some understanding and information of those perceptions, then I can actually, like, if I knew that you all hated this right now and didn't like this, you know, then I could do better, right? But when you don't know, you just kind of have to do it. And so the more insight we get, it's like gold. So I think understanding how members perceive their relationships, like value and trust, those kinds of things, they really are the insight that helps us in this translation part. And then agreement is interesting. We don't put this into the tool yet. I don't know why we haven't, but we'll often look at a question, and I'll give an example of this. I promise to stop diverting so we can get to the good stuff. Where like the success, you know, if you ask people how successful has a network been, it's interesting to know that some say successful or some not, but to understand, like, to the degree to which we're on the same page, whether we think the network is successful or not, matters to how we manage it. Because if we are not all in agreement of, like, for example, what success is, then we can't get there. Okay, I'll show you that in a real example. But I wanted to bring this up because what you often see in an SNA is what I'm calling interrelationships. And I'll be honest, like, we're going to start a couple of projects coming up here where someone has done a network analysis before, and I love that. But when I look at what they gave them interrelationships, and and people don't react to that very well. They don't understand what density means, and they don't really understand the maps. It's all that data behind it. And I always say the network map is like the front cover of the story of your network, and then you open the book and there's all that information about your network, the story of your network. And that's what those other boxes for me are. So and you collect it through a network analysis. So you're collecting it through a dyadic. You need that network analysis to get this. Not always. Like Darren Hicks's survey, the process quality working together, we have put on to a lot of our surveys, and it's amazing information, and it's not at the dyadic level. Okay, so let's go through just some examples. I did decide to start with this because I kind of gave you the story of the 12 networks. And I wanted, before going into one of those networks, I thought, let me show you this. So if you are doing multiple networks or networks of networks, this could have been called networks of networks. Where it's basically the state is a whole bunch of networks, right? Each one of these bars represents one of those early childhood councils. They just say rural and urban because we didn't want to identify them. For example, this is our response rate across those different. You'll see our highest response rate came from this very rural area where over 80% of the people in the network responded. And so our goal was 70% across the project, and you can see how that kind of varied. So just one way, I'm just showing you a few ways to just show data across a bunch of networks. So for example, here, the number of partnerships that were reported. You can imagine if you have more people in the network, they're going to report more partnerships because there are more possibilities for that. But you can see here in this network, they reported 706 partnerships in this really, really rural area of Colorado. And you'll see that a couple of the rural areas reported the most. I mean, it's up for, you know, debate whether urban or rural networks are more active, but consistently a lot of our rural networks show really, really active networks. Not surprising, they kind of know each other. And over here is, you know, our smallest one was this urban network here. So just a couple of examples here. And then what we did here, I'm going to show you this one by one in a second, but we asked, of all the partnerships that you have in your network, that you as a organization have with other organizations, how many would you say were created, you know, came about because of the ECC? How many were strengthened through the ECC, or wait, attributed to the ECC? Sorry, this is an overall score. That's what this is. And then how many were created through the ECC and how many were strengthened by the ECC? Now there's all kinds of work going on outside my window. It's very loud. So you can see here, overall, what we do is we take this, this is a question on your network survey, which asks at the dyadic level, is this relationship that you created strengthened through the ECC, through the initiative, the network, or developed through? And then we use this blue bar to show how many we combine them, how many we can attribute to the network intervention. This is important. This is an important point for the people working in the network to get to be able to brag about. I think it's so important to say, we have done this work and people are saying that because of this, we are building and strengthening systems. So here's, some data and numbers on it. And it's not just a story that I'm telling you, right? So looking like this area, almost every single one, that they, there's more, there's 100% of relationships in each one, but here almost all of them were built through the ECC. So you see variation across this for sure. But I love this data point because I'm like, stand on the mountaintop and yell this out because if you're doing hard work, take credit for it, and of course we're contributing the outcome to all the work we're doing, but I think this is a really important point. And this was where we asked of all, so these are at the dyadic level. So this is, I pulled out data that you can't get from just a normal survey, right? So at the dyadic level, and again, these are all the networks, what are they doing together? So when I have a partnership, what are we doing together? And you can see that most of the work was to improve services. You saw some exchange of resources, and you can see some variation. This urban community, they reported a lot of activity together. So you can just start to see across your networks of networks some differences in the ways to kind of understand it. This is, again, descriptive, so you can really just tell that story really well with it. I think what I'm going to do here, so this was what areas they were working in. Whoops, I don't want to go, so I don't want to spend too much time right here, but what you'll recall is that what we were looking for is what's happening in home visitation. So what we found in these early childhood networks is that early learning was where most of the activity was happening. So these are number of overall partnerships, right? And then we had some other areas. This rural one, they were doing a lot of stuff, but everyone dropped off at home visitation. And so that was just an area. This is the McVie program. It's a federal home visitation program here in the U.S. Working on this. And then like here is this one down here that almost, they almost said they weren't doing very much together. So much variation, and it's interesting. I would look for outliers like this, like what the heck were they doing in health that obviously no one else is doing? They have some intervention that's happening, fairly successfully there. So all of this, I always like to think about every data point as leading to an action step or a strategy. So I'm always asking, what can I learn from this? And what can my network learn from this? And obviously there's some points here that say, look, we've been putting a lot of money in early learning. It's been working. Look at all the work we're doing. We're trying to put money into home visitation. Obviously that is a place we can improve. So this is almost like just validating that we are focusing in the right area if we're trying to build some network ties right now. But health was the other area. I would say it's so interesting years later now. I'm sure if we did this because of social determinants of health and all the health integration work that's happening, that would be just skyrocketed right now. Okay, so I'm going to go through a little bit of how we take this data and turn it into some lessons. So this is now where I'm looking at just this one. These were 3 counties, are just super small. How we took some of that data and we reported it out. So this was the question around attribution. And then we asked people here, how are partnerships strengthening the early childhood system? In BOC, we call it. And here's where, 43 dyads, so 59% said they resulted in improved services or supports for children. So this is where I feel like we can take the data and we can start saying, well, here is, areas where because we are working together, we can attribute it to these outcomes here. And I said, ultimately it's child and family outcomes improved. These are still process outcomes like exchange of resources, improved screening, referral, things like that, increased organizational capacity. This is where we can look, if we want to build strategies in our network, we can say, I remember more is not better, right? Always the first thing. So the first question is, how does this look? Is this an area where we want to work on and have a better score? And the answer may be no. So it's really important when you're translating these to practice to ask, figure out what your strategy is. If our strategy is not to increase the organizational capacity of each of these organizations, great. This is just icing on the cake, right? But what's probably, in this case, to improve screening, referral, and follow-up process, that was actually a huge thing they wanted to work on. And here's the data to say, look, we have, out of all of these partnerships, 90 in this very little teeny tiny county. We only have this 34% of them are working on this, or have been able to improve this area. Let's do that. That's a strategy area for us. That's a work group for us to work on. And again, I love to do this data collection years later. I'm sure that's so much better these days. We said, how are they making a difference? And consensus, you'll see it says more than 20% because we pulled it way down because there wasn't a lot of consensus in this. So we're we call it our bragging document, our highlights document. So this is where we're taking the data and trying to communicate how much we've accomplished, right? So it's a little spin on the data there, to be honest. But these are things that we asked people what was going well. And then, down here, what are partners doing together? So you saw this across all of the networks. So this is just broken down for this one. And not surprising, you'll see health and home visitation down here. Their social, emotional, mental health work was also kind of on the lower end here, where they were specifically also trying to work on that. Where others in this networks were doing really well. So one thing I always say to groups like this is, like, if one group is doing health well, now we know if we're going to get together for a workshop, let's ask them what they're doing and how that's working, what are their practices, and how can we translate that in our context, in our network. So this is kind of helping find who's doing well and who's not, so we can either find the gaps or, leverage those strengths. I'm gonna go on because I want to get to some of the other examples, not good examples, but these are, so imagine I'm presenting this back to them. I always stop and have these questions to consider, and we put them in our reports too. So it seems really obvious, right? Are these results what we expected? Any thoughts about things to work on? It's super important. Just stop. Let your group ask and answer these questions. And to be honest, I can say, I'm a network expert. I know all these things. I do not know this community nearly as well as these folks do. So they need to help me understand what actions, how to translate the data. So it's really important that we have these conversations and hear from them. We can turn these into recommendations later in a report, but let's process together. Here's where we asked a question on the survey, what are you doing together? And this is just a visual on what you just saw before, but here's where you can add to it who is working together on these things, and if it's the same people or not. In areas where there's not that much activity going on or low connectivity, at least you might want to know who is working on home visitation together, because then maybe we can say, sorry, my screen's covering that. That's funding together. And if we want to figure out, what they're doing there, we can ask them. So JD, you said you did follow-up in-depth interviews. Great. And now you might have some targeted questions to ask. If you're a funder, a lot of funders want to use this kind of information to kind of see where, their grantees are working together and how to leverage that kind of stuff. Let me do this for a second. This was a close-up view of one of the home visitation networks. So what you're seeing here are these gray nodes, which are all in one area together, and then these extra kind of periphery nodes. What we did is we took those gray nodes that were part of the home visitation network, and we just looked at them, and we were like, oh, holy smokes, they don't actually have connections to each other, even though they kind of look connected here. What happened is when you pull out a subgroup of your network, you can do a little bit of a more in-depth understanding of how they're connected. This is always really interesting when your subgroup is not connected. So again, more is not better, right? Necessarily. So the first question is is this okay? Like, is it okay that early intervention is not connected to Rocky Mountain parents as teachers? Or they're connected through Bright Beginnings. It looks like Bright Beginnings there is kind of a hub. Is that all we need? Because if that's all we need, then we're doing really well and we're not taking as many resources to do other things. So you need to ask those questions and kind of figure out what are these potential strategies? Should we bring missing partners in? Should we strengthen relationships and consider ways to leverage those ties? This is a different view of that network later where they are connected more tightly. And so maybe if this was our strategy at a time point too, we can see where those ties have actually built up and then attributed it back right to our network work and say, there's a huge return on investment in our systems building work because our strategy was to build more ties and more connections. So because we knew that was our strategy, we've met it. I mean, if our strategy is everybody's overwhelmed with connections, we need to figure out how to go to this so that we can not make everyone work so hard, but we need to be able to know that Bright Beginnings is the right connector between these other 4 nodes. That could be a different strategy. So just keep in mind that I'm not saying one is better here. In this case, they did grow. So there's that. Let me give one more good example. Always stop with your questions to consider. This one is the one I mentioned with CAP as an example earlier. These are our trust and value questions, but in this case, this is the value question in partner that's broken down to power and influence, level of involvement, and resource contribution. So what we've done here is we took perceptions, right, of these ways of scoring each other at the dyadic level. I hope that's all making sense. And then we aggregated them, but we split them into groups. So what we did is we said, so blue is power and influence. So again, in the survey, it would be me saying to Melinda, I rate her as a 3 on power and influence. And she could rate me and, back and forth. And then we are grouping them and averaging them. So what you're seeing, this is all power and influence, level of involvement, and resource contribution. The blue is all members' average perception of value. So every dyad, we just averaged it. The red is all the members' perception of the Early Childhood Council is actually an organization or a set of organizations in the network. So we pulled out the perceptions of just them. The green is the ECC's perception of all their partners. So let's call the ECC the backbone organization for a second. This would be saying the red is everyone's perception of the backbone organization. The green is the backbone's organization's perception of all of its members. So here's what happened. We figured this out and we say, okay, one thing that's interesting here is we think 3 or less is kind of a place where we want to work on. So, we're kind of verging on that here. The view of the backbone organization by all the members is sky high. So much perception of value. What's really interesting is the backbone organizations of its partners started to look different, still higher than the average in these 2, but dropped really low here. So I can tell you what happened is we were asked to present this back to the board. The board's looking at it and, during the prep for the presentation, the ECC or the backbone organization basically says to us, do not show this because this is showing that our perception of our partners is really low on their resource contribution. So they asked me not to present it. And I didn't, and I thought, it's okay. Well, we'll just do this internally. But during the meeting, they also gave them the report. And I remember she was a real data geeky kind of person, saw this in the report and raised her hand and asked me in front of everyone if that's what this meant. So I had to kind of deal with it right on the spot. And here's my interpretation of this. This backbone organization is not getting what they need from the network, right? They need resource contribution to be happening for this to be a high functioning network. That is for sure a strategy. This backbone is perceiving the members not to be contributing in that way. And yet they're afraid to tell the members. So this is not good network building, right? Because this is the hard truth is that it's not happening. The members aren't doing what they need to do to make this network successful. This backbone organization needs others to know. They need this board to know, but they didn't want the board to know that they did this. What I think this showed was a place where the backbone Backbone said, hey, network members, we aren't perceiving you to do the part you need to play in order for us to be a good, strong, healthy network. But here's where we can turn it into strategy and action. We also ask in the survey what resources you can contribute, right? So here's a list of them. This shows who can contribute what, and there's these little stars even in here by when people said, you intentionally can't really read this, it's okay, what they most want to contribute. So what this Backbone organization needs to do at this time is go to this chart, look at who said they want to contribute what resources, and then start to build a strategy around leveraging these resources. So in this one survey, you have all this data. And in all this data, you can get to the hard to talk about substance of some of your work and use this to start having an open conversation about how we're actually a network and the Backbone is not actually responsible for leveraging all the resources, right? So there's just a ton to unpack in there, and you can imagine how that would need to go, and it would have to be all done in context of your network, right? So as an outsider, what we did for these networks is we took all their data points, we made a report where every single data point had a recommendation next to it. At this same meeting, we had them go through these, and like they would see a data point and a recommendation, and then someone would go, oh, it's been 3 months, we already did that, and they would X out our recommendation. We'd go, great. Or they'd get to a recommendation and they would say, this does not resonate with us, this is not us. And we'd go, okay, you know, we're external, we didn't know, and they'd exit out. We had about 40 recommendations. By the end of that, they had like 3 or 4 that they said, this resonates, this was one, they were like, this is it. They had 3 or 4 action steps at the end of this meeting. And I was like, that was super successful. Because in systems change and network building, if you have 3 strategies, go with it. Like, you cannot overwhelm your network. You can't have 20 strategies and think that your network is going to be able to implement those. So more is not better. Take 1, 2, 3 lessons learned from your data. And you could have asked this huge survey and had 40 recommendations, and you get down to 3 or 4, and you have been very successful, and that network can successfully implement those strategies. Okay, I'm realizing, as usual, I just like talk like crazy, and I'm way towards the end here. There's a little bit more in here. I will only say this one because I mentioned it earlier. This question is in the partner survey, but you can ask it. This is not even a network question. This is just asking people, how successful do you think that we've been at meeting our goals? What is fascinating about this, if you have nothing else to start with, you don't have time to analyze your data, this success question is so interesting because this question in our whole survey has more variance than any other question, meaning most people disagree. And what's so fascinating about this is that, you know, you get half the room to say somewhat successful, you have half the room saying somewhat unsuccessful, and now you're like, wait, what are we even calling success? What I have found is that a lot of people think like we've had a good webinar, like we've had a good meeting, success. Others are like, we've had good meetings, but we haven't changed that, you know, moved the dial on child and family outcomes. So I'm going to rate this unsuccessful. I always say, if you cannot agree and define what success is, you cannot get there together as a group. So this is a great slide that I would show my group to be like, what is success? Group, you know, is it good meetings or is it this? And if we're trying to get there together, how are we going to know it and how are we going to see it? And so to me, this is one of those agreement questions where we're like, wait, we are disagreeing, we're not on the same page here. Even if we think we're unsuccessful, let's at least get on the same page that we're either successful or unsuccessful. This is a really bad place for a network to be, for the leader of it, right? You're like, what do I do now? You know, half the group thinks we're good. So you have to unpack this. You have to get in deep into this and try to understand this before you can almost go to like any next step. I'm going to stay on right now, acknowledging that we're at the top of the hour, and if anyone needs to leave, I will keep recording so you could come back to it. But what I want to do, you know, you can imagine there was just so much more that we could have gone through. And as we're talking and ending here, the 2 things I want to show you are the 2 reports that I wanted to bring up, but I want to open it right now for just any questions from anyone. You can either speak up or put them in the chat.